Alrighty, so here I have like a kind of a jamming template right now, and I'll tell you first a little bit about what we have here, and then we'll throw the plugin in here. I have one channel that is just a synth. Next to that, I have a kick drum, snare drum, and hi-hat that's all made with Operator. So I got these great loops like this grain slicing breakbeat slicer thing that I made. And it's just going to randomly play back little segments, which I find is actually a really cool way to explore the latent space inside of the Combobulator. How do you play with this thing? So first of all, let me give you a given. This thing has built into it, unfortunately, a lot of latency. But if you go and look at any other AI-generated anything out there, there's always a little bit of latency because generating new content from scratch is still a process, and it still takes at least a little amount of time. People are used to putting a plugin on and just having it be really, really fast with everything else. So what we started doing was releasing these low latency models, which are lower quality, but you can beatbox into them, and they're very, very fast. So we have the best of both worlds now. If you want really high quality, there's going to be a long latency. If you want more performability, we have the low latency models that we're rolling out gradually. But today, I think mostly we're going to be working with the high quality models. And my advice is to set this up on a group and jam with it for a while. Like really, maybe just over a drum loop, something simple, and harvest ideas, and then just run a recording of the jam. And then when you're done using it, save the preset and then delete it from the session so all the latency goes back to 0. That's a really good workflow, I think, for working with this. So right now I have a Combobulator on this group, and you see there's a little latency when I hit play when it comes out. Okay. All right, I'm going to bring in the wet. Yeah, lower notes, lower tones. Ooh. So I'm going to play a little bit of this African clip into it, and then play some notes along with it, and we'll see what comes out. Because to my knowledge, I don't think there were like any like loops that sounded like this African clip in the data set. So the way you can think about this is these neural networks are small. They're not like ChatGPT. They don't know everything. They only know what you've ever shown it. But it's never seen, quote unquote, it's never seen African drumming. So when the Ataya model hears African drumming and tries to recreate it, it's going to recreate it as if this music producer, Ataya, was making African drumming music. Oh yeah, I like those deep bass sounds. All right, so right now we're off to a pretty good start, but it's starting to sound a little repetitive. So if you're ever getting that feeling of like, this doesn't sound great, the first thing to do is try to change what the input signal is. So let me mess around with the synth itself and see if we can tease out some different sounds out of this. Heard a little bit of cutouts right there. That's actually completely normal. If the Combobulator gets too much or too little volume, sometimes the neural network gets a little bit confused, and that confusion can cause an output of silence or quietness or something. And that's because it can only ever reproduce in the ballpark of what it's learned on. So if a neural network has never seen this much volume, if you're sending a clipping signal into it, it won't really know what to do with it. So I suggest if you're getting any cutouts that you don't like, put a little compressor before the signal gets to the combobulator. Let's remember what this sounds like. Now it's funny bringing down the dry wet. Now the dry signal to me is like very digital, very kind of beginning my track sort of sounding, maybe like a demo. But even though the output of this might sound a little like muffled, it's like the amorphousness, actually the timbres are really complex, sounds really layered. But remember, it's generating all of this right now from scratch. It's just as much as Serum is generating its sounds right now. Okay, so once we kind of figure out and kind of dialed in the pre-processing a little bit, this is a part where we can really have an opportunity to make things interesting. How to really get a lot out of this plugin is to modulate the latent space. Now, what is latent space? You might have heard of the black box that is AI. Like you send in with ChatGPT, for instance, you send in the text, and it's really hard to really trace back how exactly it's going to get its answers. This works that same way. You can send the exact same snare drum into it, and every time it'll return something like slightly different, but pretty much the same, because it's synthesizing that interpretation, you could say, of a sound, the snare drum in this example, each time from the same place inside of its latent space, from the same area. And latent space, you can imagine, is this giant 64-dimensional space. It's really hard to quantify. But imagine it's a giant brain, basically. And you send a snare drum into it, and it says, well, where's the snare drum? This is a snare drum part of my brain. I think that it sounds like this. It returns a timbre that's pretty close to a snare drum. Well, when you start modulating the latents with scale and offset and encoder and bend and dilation, freeze and reset and all that stuff, when you start playing with the latents, you're actually shifting where inside of that brain that your combobulator is thinking of. You're actually hacking the brain itself. You're hacking the neural network with these controls. And so what better way to hack a neural network than to actually modulate the latent space and do so in an undulating rhythmic way, maybe. This is kind of undulating music, so I think this will be nice. So what I'm going to do is go over to this LFO. We're going to put it on, I don't know, let's do like a quarter note here and go to like a sine wave. Yeah, let's turn that up. And I'm going to send this over to scale. There we go. And you can hear now how that actually changes the timbre. Well, we can change it even more by separating how the modulation is modulating each latent. Latent variables decide where it's getting its information from. So what we're doing is we're scaling and we're offsetting those numbers. But we don't need to do them all at the same time. We can stagger how they are being modulated, and that's what stagger is all about. So watch how this starts to ripple. Yeah. That's super cool. Let's do another LFO, and let's put that bad boy onto offset, and we can do the same thing here with the staggering. And slowly now you hear that this is starting to be pushed to a part of the neural network that might have a little bit more like impact. I'm actually hearing it go a little bit harder, which I think is cool. Actually, as we're going to want to maybe encourage more transient, let's actually turn down the sustain and up the attack a little bit. Wow, that's really interesting. Okay, so I am going to show you a little bit about how I like to post-process this as well, because I know it sounds strange. This is a totally new way of doing synthesis. It is to me, it's really punk rock. It sounds like you're messing up an MP3. You have these artifacts, and the way that it's able to do it in real time actually is very similar to how an MP3 is able to compress very large files down to very small ones. You're recreating this signal out of basically higher dimensional variables that have been brought down to lower dimensions or something like that. I'm not much of a scientist. Anyway, let's go ahead and post-process this a little bit to make it sound a little bit more palatable and maybe, a little better, a little bit more intense even maybe. So one thing I like to put on Combobulator right away is a little bit of multiband dynamics. So if I just listen to the top end right here, for instance, let's go up here. I might think, oh, that might be a little bit too much dynamics. Or at least you want to limit how loud it gets in the top end. So I actually like to squish my top end quite a bit. And actually you can have a little bit less squish. And then just bring up the output a little bit if it ends up getting a little dull. I like to squish my mid-range a little bit. And of course the low end. I like to squish that a lot, but put the ceiling really high. And I like to do a peak. And don't need a knee, really. Look, that's not really doing that much. And then after that, of course, always got to have my glue compressor. Now, this is kind of the base recipe, but now we can get kind of creative. Like I said, it has this kind of digital sound to it. So one way I've really enjoyed getting creative with my mixes with this thing is I've been using this plugin called 2Tape. Now, this was also on Andrew Huang's best plugins of 2024 list. I definitely want to echo the recommendation. Just for a sanity check, this is what it sounds like dry, wet. Oh, that is fun. So at around this point, you can start doing a recording if you're liking what you're hearing. Oh, listen to that. Woo! What? That's crazy because Ataya is actually famous for making really clean, really smooth dubstep. Now, this is the second newest model that we have next to Ataya. Let's hear how this sounds. I'm going to actually take out the bass and, listen to even this texture right here. Where did this come from? Let's take out the bass because Kraftel is a really good sound designer. Listen to these weird sounds. What? What is that? All right, let's do a little bit of these percussions. But let me show you another cool thing to do before we hit the Combobulator. Let's put some reverb on everything before it goes into the Combobulator, right? So we're going to put this thing on there to remind you what this sounds like. Hey, let's make this a little bit less crazy, too. Let's go like... Yeah. Oh, that's cool. Let's bring it in. Now, because of the nature of this thing, when I scale up or down, it actually produces really different results, especially when you got stagger on. because when you're staggering the latents to go up in a different order versus down in a staggered order, you're actually reaching to different dimensional locations within inside of the latent space. So that is why we've also created the ability to modulate the modulators. So let's go ahead and change how it's scaling on both of these to where it cycles between scaling up and cycle between scaling down. We'll do it with a triangle wave, and we're going to put this guy right here. Ooh, right there. There we go. And notice that we have a depth knob right on the knobs themselves, and you can invert the depth of these. So you can see as this guy's scaling up, that one's scaling down. Let's put it on beat. Maybe we'll do 2 bars. All right, let's go in and hear how this sounds. It honestly sounds like I'm moving through a Craftal sample pack. There's like all these one hits that it's finding. Yeah, these little interesting sounds in here. I'm just loving it. So notice some of these models we have version 1, version 2. Let's try out the Craftal version 1. I was a big fan of version 2. This one's a little more gentle. Let's bring back in the bass. Yeah. All right, let's go get Eli Derp. Let's try this one. Now you'll notice that Eli Derp's snare is very distinct, and I listen to a lot of Eli Derp. You could say I'm a fan, and his snare does sound just like this. One thing I really like about his model. One of my favorite parts about working with neural audio are the emergent, ghostly properties inside of this stuff. Notice that sometimes voices come through. To me, that's really interesting. It's almost like we're cooking up this neural audio soup, and anything you throw in that original recipe, sometimes there will be little chunks of later on. In Eli Derp's sample collection, and by the way, we go through each of these sample collections by hand before we train anything. And Eli Derp's collection mainly had tons of samples in addition to all of his original mixes and stuff. So inside of there's voices samples, there's drums, there's bass. Now, if you want to tease out some more of these latent ghosts inside of the machine, one way that you can do that is you see down here with my auto filter, you can go into like a bandpass and then turn up dry wet on like a reverb a lot. And let's just really smear this thing. I'm going to turn up the decay a lot. That's like a radio, right? Let's load up a new model. I really like the Alicia model. Okay, let's check this out. So this is a section that really I have to give the credit to this section to our developer, Luka Askoff. He's the lead developer on this project. And as he was tinkering around with the code, he started realizing like some really interesting hacks and ways that you could hack the latents. So one way here is encoder. You see, the way that this version of AI works is with what's called a VAE, a variational autoencoder. So Luca realized that you could actually kill the connection between the encoder and the decoder, where it's still going to be trying to interpret what's coming in, but if you turn this knob down, it gets a hazier and hazier view of those numbers as it comes in. And once you bring the encoder all the way down, you've disconnected the input from the interpreter. So I know that sounds a little strange, but let's get cooking on this. We can start doing some really interesting things here with freeze and bend and stuff. For instance, I put it right here. Now, as it's doing this, you might say, yeah, that's cool, but it kind of decays into a single note. So we want a way to like move it around and stuff. So when we do freeze, what it does is wherever the latents currently are, it then augments the latents from there. So it takes it as a baseline, which is kind of strange, but if we bring this all the way up and then hit freeze, we're now in a different part of the latent space, and that's not very lovely, is it? We'll do freeze again. Now we also have this thing called bend and dilation. Now bend is like circuit bending, and dilation is like a parameter connected to it. These are basically made up parameters because no one's ever really done this before. But what this does is it reinterprets the audio signal a completely different way in a block-to-block process, and how it is affecting the latents. By the way, you might have seen width right here. This looks at the stereo field kind of differently from other things. Basically, there's two combobulators in here, and they're both in mono. And width spatializes where in the neural network it's getting the information. So it's basically like a miniature offset for the left and the right channel. That's what width does. So I normally like to put an LFO on it. Let's try out a different model. Yeah, so this is the Mr. Bill drum model that was just released. I'm very excited about this because it specializes in drums. Hey, I like this patch I just came up with. This is an envelope where the scale is getting inverted by this other LFO. That's cool. Let's do another one of those and put it onto offset. Whoa. Okay, wait, let me go record. Wow. Wow. This side of the neural network is it's totally acoustic drums. Did you hear that? So we're like, think of it like that. You're inside this brain, and there are corners of the brain that like, this corner is clearly thinking about acoustic drums, and this other corner up here is clearly thinking about like more percussive sounds. Because we train this on hundreds of gigabytes of Mr. Bill drum sounds, which span the whole gamut. So let's move through those. Listen to that. It sounds like real drums. Let's kind of lean into that a little bit. I'm going to put that maybe on the encoder. I love that. I get a kick out of that because I never heard, before this kind of technology came around, I never actually heard synthesized sounds that sounded that real. I mean, it might sound a little gritty, you know? It might sound about as digital as a lot of digital samplers sounded like when it first came out, but it's being generated right then, and that there's something really strangely magical about that.